So our next speaker is Stephen Rigby. Stephen is the NDIS coordinator for Hunter Friends of Lush. Stephen is a social worker and current member of the Australian Association of Social Work. He completed his Masters of Social Work in 2012 through the University of New England and also holds a Bachelor of Arts from the University of Sydney. Stephen has been supporting people with intellectual disabilities for over 10 years. He has been involved with a number of large communities in Australia and has a passion for supporting individuals with complex needs and who do not use words to communicate. Please welcome Stephen.
Hello everyone, I'll just adjust this mic. Look, I want to start by thanking all of my fellow panellists for being here. And I want to say that I think we're all in pretty broad agreement in that we all think here tonight, certainly on the panel, that the NDIS and the whole change that's coming is positive. And certainly I for one, admire those that have designed it and pushed it through Parliament and so on. And I think it will be a very positive change to how disability is funded in Australia and how people with disability are supported. As a social worker, I am very impressed, and I think it's really good that the NDIS will give people with a disability greater control over their own lives. That it allows them to be the authors of their own lives. It allows them to have greater self-determination over their own lives. All of which I think is very positive. In addition, I also believe that the NDIS, when it is fully rolled out nationally, will be very positive for the disability sector as a whole, in that it will enable individuals to move from one location to another, one state or territory to another, with a minimum amount of paperwork and complication. It is also my hope that it will lead to consistencies in funding across the country, so that we won't have some of the differences between different state systems. I am also pleased to know that, or pleased to hear that the assessments of the NDIA will largely be based upon capacity or upon individual needs instead of diagnosis. For me, it brings home that idea that each individual is different, and what's right for one person with a particular diagnosis, for example cerebral palsy, is not necessarily right for everybody with cerebral palsy. I'd also like to acknowledge the work and the difference that Ability Links has made here in the Hunter in terms of linking people with disability into those natural supports and into groups of people that are not necessarily all people with a disability. And I also would like to acknowledge the enormous amount of work and tools and resources available on the NDIA website, particularly in terms of the Practical Design Fund, particular projects. There's a number of plans up there and various other resources for people. I also want to acknowledge, and I want to make a clear point about the fact that I think we really do need to acknowledge that this is a trial and that we're all learning on the job as we go along. However, I want to make a couple of comments based upon my own personal experience. I do have a number of significant questions, and I raise these not as a criticism of anybody involved or of the system, but I raise them hopefully as points that can be considered in future deliberations and hopefully lead to a better system in the long term. The first comment I would make is that while as a matter of public policy I do understand the rationale of a staged rollout and for a trial, and as I've said, it's important that we acknowledge this. And I know that there are detailed plans for the government and for the agency. However, one of my concerns is that I'm not sure that this has been particularly well communicated among the wider society, and certainly among people with intellectual disabilities and their families. Recently, a few of us were at a carers forum organised by the Hunter New England Health here at the Panthers in town. And there were a number of families who I spoke to personally who were very concerned because they didn't know what was happening for their child with a disability. And there was a lot of uncertainty for them because they lived in places like Port Stephens or Maitland. Now, I know, and we all know on the panel, that there's a particular plan and they'll be put in at a particular point, depending on where they are, but I'm not entirely sure that this is particularly well communicated to families and to people outside of trial sites and those not currently included. So the first thing I would like to see is more open and better communication with people with disabilities and their families, and more communication in plain English for people who may not read so well or may not have such good communication skills. The NDIS is largely based on a market approach. The participant, once assessed, is able to choose or select with support from a range of different services available and a range of different providers that offer a particular service. As a matter of public policy, I do understand that we live in a globalised economy and a world that's very much based upon people making choices on an economic model. However, among the problems that I have with this approach is that it assumes that all individuals have the same access to information and the same ability to make decisions. In the case of people with intellectual disabilities, I have two specific concerns in terms of this. First, it assumes that all people with intellectual disability are able to understand the information that they are provided with by a range of different service providers in the NDIA, and that they are able to understand and weigh up the choices in front of them. Obviously, these capacities vary widely among individuals with all disabilities, just as they do in the wider community. And obviously, many people with all types of disabilities have families, friends, and other advocates to support them. However, from personal experience, I know that many individuals with intellectual disabilities live very much in the moment. In L'Arche, we know that this can be a gift. However, it does make it very difficult to make decisions like the choice between having fewer days of a day program and having one-on-one support. As opposed to having support all week but being part of a group. Or living more independently but having less hours of support or even less people around to interact with. Second, for me it assumes that all people with intellectual disability have an equal ability to exercise their choice and control. Again, this obviously varies, and I recognise that many people with all types of disabilities have support in this, and I recognise that some service providers in the NDIA do a good job of supporting people. However, I'd like to consider a couple of aspects involved in exercising choice. One essential element of the ability to exercise choice for me is having confidence that when you do exercise choice, that you can speak your mind and talk about your opinions without negative repercussions. While I acknowledge that this is written into the Act, it certainly is made clear by the NDIA. I think we need to consider the circumstances in which some people come. I think we need to acknowledge that many people with disabilities, and particularly people with intellectual disabilities, come from backgrounds where in the past they have come from institutionalisation or have been victimised in a variety of ways. I know from personal experience that there are many people who see any sort of planning meeting as a meeting in which they are going to get into trouble. and see any time they're asked to come to the office or to a main office as a potential time when they may be in trouble and may be potentially kicked out of their home. I suspect that a person with these experiences who is perhaps suddenly taken by staff or other individuals to a meeting with someone who they've never met in a big office in a building that they've never been to before, and taken into a room to meet someone that they have never met, and then asked, are you happy where you're living, or do you like the services you're provided with, or do you like what you're doing, he's probably going to say yes, regardless of how they actually feel. For me, the second element of this is about communication. The NDIS is very much built on choice and control for individuals with a disability. But the question for me is, how well can people exercise this choice and control if they find it hard to communicate and hard to be understood? At the beginning of this evening, John and I introduced you all to Jason. Jason is very fortunate in that he has a very supportive family and a very strong group of friends around him who will support him through all the processes and decisions that have to be made if and when the NDIS comes to Brisbane. However, Jason is a man who does not communicate with words. He sticks his tongue out for no and smiles for yes. Now I'd like you to think about that for a second. You need to think, based upon personal experience, I can tell you need to think very carefully about the questions you ask someone like Jason. Because you've got to ask a question that has a yes or no answer. And even something as simple as, are you happy with where you're living? Well, if he says no, then you've got to find out what that is. So that's another series of questions. So it requires people to have a certain amount of relationship and background and ability to know the right questions to ask. Now, as I said, Jason is a man who has support and who I and most others who know him have no concerns about, because he will be supported by those who care about him. But my question in effect is, how does someone like him with his communication skills, who does not have effective family support or other support, go through a planning and assessment process with the NDIA or any other agency? How does a person like this exercise their choice and control? While I do accept that Jason and those like him are in some ways a very rare case, from personal experience I know that many people with intellectual disabilities can have limited communication skills. For some it's the ability to say yes or no. For others they can say 5 or 6 words. For others they speak with a slurred speech. For yet others, they might have the ability to say a word like okay that can mean a multitude of different things. I asked this question at a service providers meeting here in Newcastle a little while ago with the NDIA State Director, and this was a services meeting, and he assured me that the NDIA staff would take whatever time was required. And while I know that he meant that, and while I know that there's the best of intentions, I have to say that I found this much less than convincing at the time. While I believe that, as I said, that he meant this, the fact is that from personal experience and from what Cindy and Joe and Rosie have shared, it takes a lot of time to support people to make choices. It can take months. In many cases, particularly those with complex needs like Jason, it can take years. And it's very hard for me to see, with all the goodwill in the world, how a very busy public service agency can ever devote that amount of time and resources to supporting a few individuals. In short, I admire and support the policy changes that have been brought into place, and I'm broadly supportive of the NDIS and the NDIA. However, I have concerns about the implementation and how people with intellectual disabilities and the most vulnerable, especially those with communication difficulties, will be supported and enabled to exercise their choice and control. Thank you.